How did the whole founding of NerdWallet come about, and how did you meet your co-founder?
Sure. So actually, my co-founder and I have known each other since middle school. We grew up in Atlanta together. Ended up going different coasts for school and stuff. Both ended up back in New York, working on Wall Street. And then he actually came up with the idea for NerdWallet initially. Not to get into too much wonky detail, but he was a hedge fund analyst, and creditcards.com was the biggest player in the space. They were trying to IPO. Didn't work out because it was 2007, but learned a lot about the business behind the scenes, and it just didn't make sense to him that a website like that could actually serve like a digital first generation looking for financial products. If you've ever visited creditcards.com, the website was designed in the 90s and has been left alone ever since then. And is basically just an optimized funnel to make as much money as possible off of people looking for credit cards. And so Tim saw a way to make this better. And thankfully for NerdWallet, he got fired about a year later when the financial crisis hit, as did most people, on Wall Street anyway. And then he went off and decided to start working on this, and I left Wall Street shortly after that to join up with him. And so that was what originally planted the seed, and then he experienced all kinds of other issues that just nailed it home for him that your everyday consumer just can't even begin to have the time to go through all the terms and conditions and all this other stuff to actually analyze complex financial products. And even like credit cards, we think they're pretty simple. The rewards programs on a lot of these things are not very simple. The marketing makes them sound simple, but they're not actually simple. And so he saw an opportunity to kind of help people that way as well.
Yeah, no, totally makes sense. So when you started it, I mean, NerdWallet is sort of famous for bootstrapping throughout. Was this something that was a strategic decision, or did you just decide, hey, we'll bootstrap it and see where it leads?
It was kind of strategic. So at the very beginning, we looked at people like creditcards.com and Bankrate that were the biggest players in the space, and we felt like if we raised any outside money up front, we would have to give up a lot of control over our business model. And our business model at the beginning was to under-monetize relative to our competitors by providing a better service for consumers, like doing what was actually finding people the best credit card or the best savings account or the best loan, rather than the one that was going to pay us the most money. And so we knew that if we raised any investment, or we believed that if we raised any investment money up front, no investor was going to let us get away with that. So initially it was kind of strategic. We also, frankly, if we had tried to raise money, then nobody would have given it to us. So
you had a pretty good background thinking.
Yeah, it was like late 2009, early 2010. Yeah. So it was a big problem there. Two guys who neither one of us was technical. And it was an SEO content lead gen play that nobody cared about. So nobody would have given us any money even if we wanted it.
Got it. So were there any times when you guys were starting this where you're getting to a point where this may not actually make it? Should we be doing this, or should we keep on going?
Yeah, off and on for probably a good 2.5 years. We went through that. We would always kind of hit these points where nothing seemed to be working, but then magically we'd get a press hit or something. There'd be an article. We actually ended up in our first year in existence, ended up in a Money magazine article, miraculously. It got us no traffic. We made no money off of it, but somehow we ended up in Money magazine. And so that was oh, okay, cool, we're onto something. We should keep going. And then radio silence for another 6 months. And so it's very much it's not even really a roller coaster. I joke with founders I work with now that it's a steady downhill with occasional blips up. You just hope that the blips up are bigger than the steady downs. And yeah, so we went through that for 2.5 years. We didn't take our first paycheck until the company was more than 2 years old.
Wow. So what would you say was really the biggest challenge early on to sort of getting to that next level?
Well, I think the biggest challenge that we learned early on is that you can't just throw something out on the internet and expect people to give a shit. Which is what kind of led to what NerdWallet ended up becoming was, we were we built this awesome credit card tool to help people find the best credit card. We've got 1,700 credit cards preloaded into it with all the data in the database, all this stuff. It's amazing. Everybody will love it. No, that's not how it works. So then we had to start thinking, all right, well, how are we going to get it in front of people? We got to start thinking about marketing, PR, how are we going to do all this stuff? And ultimately, because of that formative experience, NerdWallet just ended up becoming a marketing company rather than really a finance company. We built essentially a content and media company because we were trying to solve that problem of how do you get eyeballs.
Got it. Got it. So also NerdWallet sort of has become like this poster child of like company culture and having a very cool company culture. How did you sort of foster that?
Yeah, well, I think one of the hardest things for us to learn, and one of the most important things about company culture that we learned, is that cool does not matter. That's not actually what defines your culture. When we first started out, we were like, we're going to build the anti-Wall Street. We're going to build the anti-investment bank. We just don't want to work at anything like where we kind of grew up. And so we did make it like a very fun, very relaxed experience and all that stuff. But that's not your culture. We kind of learned the hard way. Really, your culture is defined by how your company sets priorities, how your company makes decisions, and the culture is really what sets your company apart from other companies. It's not what you do cool that all other startups also do cool. It's like really what makes your work environment different from everybody else. And so we focused a lot on things like putting the consumer first. So one of our, we have 3 main values. I think one of the first one is like consumer, company, team, self. So it's basically all about making sure that any decision you make within the company, any product priority, anything like that, focuses on doing what's best for the consumer first, followed by doing what's best for the company, and then team, and then following up with yourself. And then another one is like something about like hard relationships or hard conversations. I forget exactly how it's phrased, but it's basically, these things were all developed after I left, but it's essentially like having positive relationships with your coworkers, but also being able to have very hard conversations with them and give critical feedback and kind of come to the best decisions through that. And then our third value to kind of play on that is drivers before solutions, which is all about figuring out what the root causes of any problem that you're trying to solve, rather than just jumping in and try to treat the symptoms. So NerdWallet's a very analytical culture. It's a very collaborative culture, but that collaboration isn't ping pong tables. It's like actually having hard conversations with people and trying to figure out what the best way to approach a given market, what the best way to scale the company, and all these other things.
Got it. So the culture was more focused around problem solving almost than it was like, hey, keg, ping pong. It was more.
I mean, we have all that too.
Yeah, of course. But it was more, you have to have that. But it was more like sort of the way people thought about the problems that they're going to solve, and that was somewhat embedded. Like, if you're, there's so many CEOs and founders here, and if they're trying to get certain things right with culture from the beginning, what would you say like those top things are that you need to like zero in on?
Well, you have to be very reflective because the culture starts at the founders. The culture is ultimately basically the founders. You can't just decide one day what you want the culture to be. It's how you act at work, how you treat people, not how you treat people like on a personal level, but like how you treat people's decisions and how you treat people's work. All of those things are your culture, whether you like it or not. And so dictating your culture as a founder is basically dictating your own behavior. So you need to figure out what kind of company you want to build and figure out whether or not that you are living that. And then it has to be built into everything you do. It has to be built into the hiring process, the training and feedback process. It has to be built into the firing process. And any decision you make within the company has to tie back somehow to the culture.
Yeah, makes sense. Sort of leading by example quite a bit. Also, so transitioning a little bit to investing, since that's what you're focusing on mainly now, what attracted you to get into investing, and how do you sort of balance like that, we were talking about this earlier, like the operational control with now the lack of control as an investor?
Yeah, well, partially, it all ties back to my motivation. So the reason I left NerdWallet was because my wife and I gave birth to twins, and so we have 2 3-year-olds at home now. So they were the reason that I stepped down, and so then when I was thinking about what I was going to do next, starting a new company was just not going to happen. I didn't want to go back to working 80-hour weeks when I had 2 children at home. And so trying to figure out what Like, what's a good way that I can stay involved in the startup ecosystem? I can be productive. I can meet a lot of interesting people. I can work on hard problems, but also be able to do it on my terms. So not necessarily having to work by anybody else's calendar, work on anybody else's schedule. And the best I came up with was investing, advising, mentoring, and just generally trying to be as helpful in the ecosystem as possible. And that's led me to where I am now. It started out just like pinging friends, like, hey, do you need any help? You want me to stop by and see what you guys are dealing with and see if I can help out? And it's ramped up. It was kind of a hobby at first just to get me out of the house. And then since then, I mean, for my sanity and my wife's, since then it's evolved into more and more of a full-time gig. And so it's my day-to-day is drinking a lot of coffee and wine and beer with founders and investors, and just trying to learn as much as possible, trying to meet as many people as possible, and trying to figure out where I can, add value.
Sounds fun to me. So when you're looking at startups to invest or advise, are there certain aspects of those startups that you're looking at, whether it's the team, the product, the sort of potential market fit? Like how do you sort of frame your thinking around that?
I mean, it's largely the founders. I mean, it's like, are these people that I want to spend time with? Are these people that I think are going to be able to crack this? Especially since I'm typically working with very early stage companies, and so the product can change a lot, the market can change a lot, pivots happen all the time, and so first thing that I'm looking at is the founders and whether or not this is a problem that they're really passionate about solving, whether or not I think they really understand the problem that they're trying to solve. Like whether or not they're asking the right questions, whether or not they're being very thoughtful about how the market actually works, what the risks ahead of them are going to be. Have they thought about how they're going to try to navigate those risks? So it's first and foremost the founders. Then beyond that, I mean, the biggest thing is just the market size. I mean, one of the things we learned from NerdWallet is if you pick a big enough market and it's growing fast enough, it covers up a lot of evils. You can make a lot of mistakes when you're in a big market. Whereas if you're in a very competitive market or a smaller market, you have much less room for error. So,
yeah. So when you transitioned, did any part of this transition into this role as a full-time investor and advisor sort of take you by surprise, or since you'd already been through it, you sort of felt like, well, I know sort of what most of the hurdles are that they'll sort of come up upon and how to help them navigate?
There hasn't been any like notable like single acute learnings, I would say. It's been a series of small learnings just about how the world works on the other side of the table, like the investment side of the world. Like one of the biggest learnings for me on the investment side was fundable companies from a VC's mindset are not companies that are going to be profitable. It's not like they're investing in a company that is going to make them money. That's not a sufficient hurdle. The way that their business model is built, a VC needs to believe that a company has the potential to be $1 billion company, or else it's not investable. You could be well on your track to build a $50 million company, and that'd be great for you. The VC is not going to invest in that, which is kind of a weird mindset, because they're just the math of how VC returns work. Most of the companies in their portfolio aren't going to make them any money, so they need 10% of their investments to return the entire fund and more, to triple their fund or something. So they basically need to make investments that they believe can be billion-dollar companies. And so that changes a lot of things about how you think about fundraising as a founder. So it gives up a lot of your optionality, first of all. So your exit opportunities have been diminished a lot once you start to raise money. The VCs are also going to push you for growth above everything else, because for them, they either want you to go to zero or to 100x their investment. Anything in between, they don't care about. And so it changes the dynamics a little bit. The interests aren't perfectly aligned. And so learning all this stuff about kind of the VC business model and how it all works was really illuminating for me, because when I first started angel investing or like working with founders, I'm like, this is an awesome idea. I can see how this is going to make money. But then no VC would ever fund it. And so as an angel, I don't have enough money to fund these companies into perpetuity by myself, so I can't invest in companies that I don't think are fundable by VCs, if I think they're going to need more funding, which most do. So,
Got it. So sort of transitioning to sort of advice for founders, is that part of the advice that you would give to founders? Is that like when you're thinking about fundraising, really think about what is that long-term exit that you're looking at and whether you should be looking at angel investors, venture capital, different types of fundraising. Is that one of the things that you're often like sort of helping them navigate?
Yeah, definitely. And there's a whole spectrum of things that you need to consider when it comes to raising money. Like, first of all, whether or not you need the money at all. I mean, everybody in Silicon Valley feels like they have to raise money because that's what gets the headlines, and it's very much it's a vanity metric, how much money you've raised, what your valuation is, all that stuff. But it's not crucial. And actually, who was it? I think Eric Paley from Founder Collective wrote a great article in TechCrunch earlier this week about how raising venture capital is it's kind of a drug, and it also limits your exit opportunities. So you, as a founder, actually potentially end up with significantly diminished outcomes versus if you didn't raise venture capital, because your exit opportunities are diminished. If you end up if you raise money like a $25 million valuation and then you turn around and sell the company for significantly less than that because nobody thinks that your company is actually worth $25 million, you as a founder are not going to make any money. Your VC is going to get all their money back. You're not going to make anything, even though you built a $15 or $20 million company. So little things like that are worth taking into account when you're thinking about raising money. The valuation that you set, so everybody wants to optimize for the highest valuation because that's where all the ego is. But that every time you raise at a higher valuation, that just kicks the bar up by like 10x. And so you're not going to get that next round unless you can raise that next round at 3 times what you raised this time. And so you have to make sure that you're able to hit those metrics and all this. So basically, raising money doesn't solve your problems, it just creates a lot more problems. For a lot of companies, you have to. I mean, you just can't get by without raising money. But it helps to think about how you're going to raise money, who you're going to raise money from, how much you're going to raise, what the valuation is going to be, and being a little bit more careful about that rather than just trying to raise as much money as possible at as high a valuation as possible from like the top tier VCs and all this. So, yeah. It very much comes into play when I'm talking to founders. And then on the other side of things, I have a lot of founders come to me and say, oh, you bootstrap NerdWallet? Tell me how to bootstrap my company. And I'm like, why would you want to bootstrap your company? Because for a lot of companies, it just doesn't make sense. Either it's going to limit your growth potential, or you're just going to starve to death, or there's a variety of other reasons why bootstrapping might not be ideal for certain types of companies.
So what, other than the fundraising side, what do you see as some of the biggest mistakes that a lot of founders make early on that you sort of try to steer them away from, or that you made early on?
Yeah. Hiring, I think, is the biggest one. Yeah, so I think that as an early stage company, at least, like 90% of your problems could probably be traced back to your hiring. And if you hire well, it very much makes everything else a lot easier. Especially a lot of founders are either first-time founders or first-time managers, have never hired people before, have never managed people before. And you find yourself in a situation where you have a team under you and you have no idea how to manage them. That process is a lot easier if those people don't really need to be managed. So then there's all kinds of other problems that come in as well. Like this is kind of the typical example of any early stage founder. You find yourself in a situation where everybody's like so inundated with work, they can't possibly ever get it all done. It's like an emergency situation. You need to bring people in. So then you go out, you post a bunch of job posts, you start hitting up your network, you find the first person that kind of meets the quality bar to get the job done that you think needs to be done, or who can just check the few boxes that you need, like, I want this stuff off my plate, here's somebody who can do those few things. So you just give that person an offer, hire them. They turn out to be kind of mediocre. So yeah, they check those boxes, but they require a lot of management oversight, they require a lot of kind of hand-holding from you, so it's not actually saving you that much time. Which is the whole point of hiring, right? Is to lever the founders even more, or lever the whole company even more. And so you end up in a situation where the person's not really performing that well, you're not all that happy with them, you wish they were taking more off your plate, they're not, but you're not going to fire them because you don't want those things back on your plate. I've always said the hardest people in an organization to fire are the B+ players, because they're doing the job, they're not doing it well, but nobody else wants to do the job, so it's impossible for you to get rid of them. So ultimately, you end up keeping them around way too long. Eventually, you do fire them. At that point, like the rest of your team is demotivated from having to work with these people because they see the same problems you see. And so it just becomes like a cancer, basically. And the way to avoid this is just be a lot more thoughtful up front about exactly what you're trying to hire. It's not about checking a few boxes to take a couple tasks off your plate. It's about finding people who don't need you to make the decisions for them. So people that you can trust to make the decisions themselves and take over, a whole function or something and actually kind of scale the organization in a sense and get more leverage out of the founding team. So be more proactive about thinking exactly what the person is that you need, and then also spending a lot more time on the hiring process to find the person who is not just checking those boxes, but is ideal. You figure out who you want to be that ideal person and hire that person. It might take a while. It's gonna hurt. You're gonna feel like this process is never gonna end, but it will eventually, and you'll end up getting 10 times more value out of it for waiting. And then you won't have to fire the person, and so it saves everybody a lot of time and problems. And I feel like this is a mistake that NerdWallet made repeatedly, and it's a mistake that I see everybody make repeatedly.
Yeah, I feel like hiring is the biggest challenge for most. Is there any other advice, before we open up for questions, any other advice that you would give to early stage founders who may be here just about, making sure that you're positioning your company outside of hiring and funding? If there are any more pivotal things that you've learned, with NerdWallet and everybody that you're speaking with, that you'd say, hey, these are things that you should really think about carefully in the sort of early stages of your company? I'm sure there's a ton.
Yeah, I mean, we covered some of the big ones. Like, don't torpedo your company by raising too much money. Don't torpedo your company by hiring the wrong people.
So, why don't we open it up? If anybody has questions.
With your background in Wall Street, what sectors relating to finance are you looking at?
Sure. So my Wall Street background has almost no bearing on what sectors I look at in terms of my investing. I look at a lot of the fintech space, but the stuff that is most appealing to me has some sort of social impact angle, or is serving an underserved market or opening new markets. I invested in a company a few months ago that's doing auto title lending, which is like a payday loan alternative. I invested in a company that's doing small business lending for exporters in developing Asia. Stuff like that, where I feel like there's underserved markets that have huge, not only economic opportunity, but social impact opportunity is the stuff that gets me the most excited. But I'm also seeing a lot of stuff. There's a lot of really old processes and old products in the personal finance space right now. Like anything involving mortgage or auto lending or insurance is just out of the Stone Ages still to this day. And so seeing a lot of companies doing interesting stuff in those spaces that we're pulling into 500, and I've invested in a couple as well. Every time I have to deal with any of my insurance companies, I'm like, well, this is why I invest in insurance companies because it's just such an annoying and upsetting experience for anybody that's like grown up in front of a computer, spends their whole time on their phone. Like, why do I have to call somebody every day to figure out what and then wait on the phone for 2 hours to figure out what's going on with my auto insurance claim. So it's basic stuff like that I feel like should have been solved 10 years ago and has still not. So.
You mentioned Bootstrap versus not Bootstrap. What is the criteria for Bootstrap versus not Bootstrap? Can you elaborate?
Well, it helps if you have revenue, if you want to bootstrap, or if you have a clear path to early revenue. Otherwise, you're just not going to survive that long. And I think that there's some companies that require a significant upfront investment in order to get a product off the ground. Anything with hard science or hard technology, anything that requires a lot of regulatory clearance. A lot of fintech falls in the space. A lot of fintech companies raise a lot more money early on because there's so many regulatory hurdles and legal battles they have to fight before they can even put a product in the market. So things like that require a lot of upfront capital. Unless you're independently wealthy, you're probably gonna have to raise money. But then there's a lot of businesses where, especially web businesses, where the development cost is effectively zero. It's just your own time. And you have a pretty clear revenue model. For us, it was lead gen. And then for stuff like that, if you can put in the time and effort to get the revenue up to a point where you can actually feed yourself, then yeah, I would say start at least with bootstrapping until you either forever and then sell the company and make a lot of money, or just until you get to a point where you discover some secret where, like, if I invested $5 million in this type of customer acquisition or something, I could 10x the value of the company. That's when you go out and want to raise outside capital.
Yeah, so my question is, having kind of departed as a co-founder, do you have any advice for managing that process to be sort of, the least painful possible?
Well, I was pretty lucky. So in my case, my co-founder and I had already decided we were going to hire a new COO, which was my title, because we were embarking on like a much bigger growth phase. We thought we were going to have to hire a lot more people than we'd ever hired in the past. We had already kind of seen the limitations of our own management ability, and thought that we needed to bring in a lot more senior talent to kind of help us through that phase. So we ended up hiring a new COO, we hired a new VP of talent, and we started working on hiring a new VP of engineering and all these other senior executives. And so I left at the same time that the new COO and the new VP of talent came on, and at the same time that my kids were born. And so it was a pretty clear message to the company why I was leaving, and I didn't have to worry about what was going to happen to the company after that because there were much better people than me taking over. So yeah, in my case, it was quite easy. And my co-founder and I are friends from way back, so I think our relationship is probably even stronger now than when we were fighting every day at work. So.
You mentioned not to raise the money with too high of a valuation. How would you recommend for the companies to calculate their perfect valuation for which they would fundraise?
If you find the answer to that question, let me know. It's more art than science. But I mean, you can kind of talk to investors and get a sense of, like, if you're raising a Series A at XYZ valuation, you can kind of get a sense of what Series Bs look like at the time and like what kind of valuations they're typically getting done at, what metrics the companies are typically hitting, and then kind of try to back into, like, am I going to be able to hit those metrics in time? How much money am I going to need to get there? Like, a lot of times, especially in the early stages, seed and Series A, the valuation is partially dictated just by how much money you end up raising and how much money you can raise. Because the VCs are going to want something like 20% of the company, and so they just take how much money they're planning to invest and they just multiply that by 5. Sometimes, not all the time, but it's definitely more art than science. And I think the key is, like, if you go out as Series A and raise it like a $35 million valuation, well, you're going to need to do like a $100 million Series B. Are you going to be able to put up the metrics that, based on what's going on in the market right now, gets people funded at $100 million? And it's not an easy question to answer, but that's usually part of the pitch. It's like, I need $2 million, I'm going to hit these milestones, I'm going to have this revenue by the end of it, I'm going to have this much head count, and I'm going to have this much, like, buffer in case I don't quite hit all that. And yeah, it's about as good as you can do.
So you mentioned that you guys didn't get a first paycheck for 2 years or 2.5 years, and then you would have these long periods of nothing happening. Psychologically, how do you push yourself to go out there and do the work and, motivate yourself and not give up? Because 1 month or 2 months seems to be enough for most people to quit. So I'm just curious how you survived for 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, we were enjoying it. I mean, even when things weren't going well, it was still fun. We were learning new things every day. Even if the metrics weren't improving every day, we were learning new things, uncovering new things. We had a sense of what work needed to get done in order to move the needle, and we knew that it would take a while. And so we just put our heads down and did the work and hoped that every now and then we would see some benefit from it. Yeah, I mean, that's basically it. It was just the two of us in an office, like, having a pretty good time. And I told myself up front, like, when I first got involved in NerdWallet, I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life after Wall Street. And so it was like, instead of going to business school or going to grad school where I'd spend a couple $100,000, like, I could probably learn just as much or more without spending that money by just trying to start my own thing. And if it doesn't work and 2 years down the road, there's no path for me ever making any money, I'll just go start handing out resumes. So I gave myself 2 years to do that anyway, and thankfully we just made it. So.
When did NerdWallet form its board, or do you have recommendations around boards for early stage startups?
We formed our board last year. The company was 5 years old. We didn't have a whole lot of say over who was going to be on the board because the board came to be when we raised funding.
And do you have recommendations for startups, like as far as getting a board on earlier, or would you do it differently next time?
We would have probably, if I had to do it differently, I would have wanted to go out and try to get more advisors, not necessarily like a proper board of directors, but at least having more people on our side who had experience in the industry, had experience going through what we were going through. That was one of the things that probably took us a lot longer than it should have, is that we didn't actually, because nobody knew who we were, we had like no brand. We were like these Wall Street guys that just dropped ourselves in Silicon Valley and we're doing our own thing. We didn't have much of a network out here. We didn't have anybody helping us. We didn't think that we could just reach out to people and they would care enough to help us. And so we just didn't bother. So 2013, right around when we started looking for a new COO and stuff, what kind of sparked off a lot of that hunt was us sitting in a conference room one day arguing, as we did every day, about some basic organizational or operational detail that has probably been solved a million times before. Eventually we just went, you know what? Why are we even arguing about this? Like, this is not a unique problem. Like, we are not some snowflake company that's going through problems that no company has ever been through before. Why don't we just try to see if anybody else has done this before? So then we just started hammering LinkedIn, cold emailing people, asking for intros, things like that, to try to meet as many people as possible who had faced specific issues relevant, or whose background seemed like they had specific expertise relevant to the issues we were facing. And then we finally started getting like really good advice from people. We ended up hiring some people that way. That's how we found the COO. That's how we found the VP of talent. And that more than anything probably changed the trajectory of the company.
How do you effectively use your board of advisors?
That's a good question because they all came together after I left. I think just generally not being afraid to ask for help and trying to be like as cognizant as possible about what you don't know and what you need help on. Being as open as possible with them. Like, it doesn't pay in Silicon Valley generally to be really close to the vest, because there's a lot of people out there that are just generally really helpful and have been through a lot and will offer up whatever help they can, whether it's useful or not. And so I think just talking to as many people as possible, being pretty open about what issues you're facing, it's really the best you can do. And making sure that you have the right advisors, making sure that it's people that are really good at things that your organization might be lacking in. So like if you're an extremely technical company, then like having somebody who has a lot of experience with sales on your advisory board, for example, might be really good and stuff like that. For us, when we started building out their advisory board, we were a media company with a very small engineering team. No brand amongst engineers. Like if you had a choice between Facebook, Dropbox, and NerdWallet, you would never choose NerdWallet. And so some of our first advisors were, like David Henke, who was senior at Yahoo and then at LinkedIn, and had a huge following amongst really technical developers. People like that were good to bring in to kind of help fill those gaps, especially on the recruiting and kind of the branding side. So that's just one example.
One, was it pretty obvious that you wanted to move to Silicon Valley once you got off Wall Street? You wanted to start a startup? And if so, why was it that obvious besides kind of just the ecosystem? You've got VCs there, you've got engineers there. Why here?
Sure. So for me, my wife grew up here. So I was going to end up out here regardless. It was just a matter of timing. But you have to remember, like 6 years ago, the tech ecosystem as it exists in New York now did not exist. It was very small. Like maybe there was Etsy. That was about it. Sure there were investors and stuff like that, but it wasn't nearly as developed as it is now. The ecosystem out here has been around for 50 years, 60 years, something like that, maybe longer. There's a lot of network effects in that sort of ecosystem. Like Silicon Valley is a very unique situation where there's such a advanced support system around startups here, and then people that have done it before that then go on to like start other companies and fund other companies and help other companies. And so there's very much, there's a lot of value to being in the ecosystem here. That doesn't mean it's the only place, but there is a lot of value here. And 6 years ago, it also was a lot cheaper to live here than in New York. That is no longer the case. But
And then just a little bit more about culture. I mean, you say it really comes from the top down, and I agree with that. But as you grew, how did you keep that culture intact, and how do you balance that with, getting a job done relative to under hiring, right? There's that balance between like, we need this done, but I don't want a B+ player because I know what that means in the long run.
So on the culture question, what I was saying earlier about making sure that it's built into your hiring processes, your training, your management, your feedback processes, and even your firing process, making sure that the culture is mindfully built into all of those things is how you kind of make sure that it scales. It's one of the ways. It also just has to be totally over-communicated. Every time Tim, our CEO, gets up in front of the company to talk about anything, he ties it back to the company culture, the values, the mission, all that stuff. Anytime we congratulate somebody on something they did, it ties back to the mission and the values. Anytime that people get promoted or anytime people, just anything like that, you always tie it back to the mission. You just end up really pounding the drum to the point that people almost roll their eyes about it, but as long as the values are meaningful and the mission is meaningful, then it'll work. I mean, if your values are integrity, like Enron, it's probably not going to stick. But if it's something meaningful that really differentiates your company from other companies, then it'll probably stick. Especially if you're hiring the right people that agree with the values and kind of agree with the mission and everything. And in terms of getting the job done versus under hiring, I would think that it actually costs you more to just get the job done than to find somebody, than to just wait until you can hire the right person to do the job. You're just not going to get the same leverage. It's going to take you a lot more time. It's going to use up a lot more management bandwidth, which is much more valuable.
Cancer too.
Yeah, and then there's the organizational effects.
To follow up on the question of advisory board members, what can the startup do to compensate the board members? I mean, is there a reasonable expectation coming and going on that item?
I think generally with advisory boards, I don't know how it's set up at NerdWallet. I assume it has to be something similar to this. Usually the advisors will get some small like equity option grant. I don't know if there's standards, but you can download template advisory agreements online. There's one that's called FAST. I don't remember what it stands for, FAST, that lays out, it's a basic legal document where you lay out exactly what the advisor is going to be committing to, and then it has some specific, like a table basically. If your company is at this stage and your advisor is going to be this involved, then this is about how much equity you should grant. So I don't really do many advisory things myself, but the 1 or 2 times I have, I just like, here, use this document. I don't know if there's anything better.
So with regards to SEO and how you're battling the incumbents, creditcards.com, bankrate.com, how could you as a bootstrap company compete? Like, what did you do?
So our thesis when we started out in SEO, there was a lot of people. So first of all, it kind of helped that we came in as outsiders and had no SEO experience or anything. Because if you read any SEO blogs or books or anything, it's mostly people trying to game the system. It's people trying to outsmart Google. And we came into it with the thesis that trying to outsmart Google was a loser's game. There's 10,000 PhDs over there trying to beat you, and so you might win the battle, but you're going to lose the war. And we also saw it as kind of thing where the goalposts are always going to be moving. Like you might figure out what's going to happen now, or you might figure out how things are working now and kind of optimize your site for that, but then they're going to change the algorithm, you're going to get screwed. So at the same time, Matt Cutts, who was the head of search spam at Google, or I should say head of combating search spam at Google, was always on YouTube and writing blog posts and stuff about like how to do SEO and answering questions from the internet and stuff. And every answer was the same. It was, if you make quality content, people will want to read it, people want to share it, people will want to link to it, and we will reward you for it. And at the time, that was only kind of true because the algorithm was very much gameable and you could make a lot of shitty content and get people to link to it and get people, pay people to link to it and stuff like that and end up ranking pretty well. But we just decided, like, you know what, this isn't going to last forever, so we're just going to make quality content. We're going to totally underperform all of our competitors in the beginning, but eventually it'll work out. And we were saved basically in 2011 when they rolled out a series of really aggressive algorithm changes. Panda, Penguin, Panda 2.0, Penguin 2.0, all these animal named algorithm changes that were specifically targeted at search spam. So people who were buying links, people who were creating duplicate content, people who had huge websites with a lot of really thin content, like a lot of pages but nothing on them really. And once those started to roll out, like a lot of our smaller competitors anyway just got totally annihilated. And so then it ended up kind of just being us versus creditcards.com and Bankrate. And that really kind of put us on the map. And so essentially all we did was we just tried to make our content better than everybody else. And we used, rather than going out and buying links or trying to do any of these black hat SEO tactics, we relied on the press. We made interesting stuff and sent it to them, and they would link to us, and they would post it, and they would share it on social media. And we ended up using PR as a content marketing strategy, which eventually got us SEO. And it's an ongoing battle. We have not won yet, but so TBD.
Thanks. I have a two-part question, but the first one is, what were or are the regulatory challenges that NerdWallet was facing?
Up until recently, none. I mean, we were literally just a media site. If anybody came to our website to sign up for a credit card, we would kick them over to Chase or Citi, so we didn't have to handle any of their personal data. But more recently, we've had to start, we started creating more of like a consumer finance product where they would log in, we can give them their credit score, we can help them find products, we can target things to their needs. We also have an app that just released a few days ago where we give people free finance advice over the app. So stuff like that required us to register as a financial advisor. We had to get a lot more, we had to get a lot better about our internal security and everything whenever you're handing people's user data. We had to go through all kinds of compliance stuff. So now we have a huge, and I shouldn't say huge, we have a dedicated compliance team, we have a dedicated legal team, all the stuff that we would have never had as a smaller startup that wasn't delving into these things. And that's the kind of stuff that most fintech companies getting started now who are actually, rather than just being lead gen, they're actually building products. They have to go through a lot of that before they even get a product in the market. And so this is why I was talking earlier about how some fintech companies have to raise a lot of money up front, and it's because these regulatory challenges and legal issues and having to add a lot more headcount than a normal startup would have to early on.
So regulatory challenge, the fintechs are more aware of that nowadays as far as at an early stage than 5 to 6 years ago.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot more companies that are being started that actually are even touching that. So I would argue that 5 or 6 years ago, a company that required a ton of money up front to even get a product in the market was probably not going to get funded, or was going to have a very hard time getting funded because of, at the time, there's so many web companies, social media companies, it costs nothing, that you're not going to fund a company at the seed stage at that point unless they have some traction or there's something clear there already. There weren't a lot of VCs that were proactively investing in things where you need $3 million to get a product into the market. So that's been more of a recent development, especially in fintech as kind of a hot space is a relatively recent development as well.
This last quick thing, are there similar platforms for consumers in Europe and Asia, like similar to NerdWallet? And is NerdWallet going to be international, do you think?
It's not on our immediate roadmap. It's an open question. Money Supermarket in the UK is probably the biggest similar website that I can think of. There are versions of NerdWallet that I've heard about in like Korea and I think there's one in like Eastern Europe, there's one in South America. I can't remember what they're called. But the market in America is clearly by far the biggest one. I mean, not only is it just a huge market from a GDP perspective, but we also just have a much more complicated personal finance industry than most other countries. So yeah, it's very different outside of here. I mean, we'd rather just focus on the US for now. But
my question is quite similar. you know, the U.S. 5% of the world's population. So I'm curious your view on the international scalability of fintech companies here, and also Silicon Valley as opposed to London as a fintech capital of the future.
It's a good question. There's a lot of great companies that come out of London, and I think what they benefit from in a large way is just less regulation. So it's actually significantly easier in a lot of ways to start, like, say, an insurance company in London than it is here. So yeah, there's been a ton of great companies that have come out of London. I can't think of any, I mean, off the top of my head, I'm not an expert on this, but I can't think of any companies that have started in one and managed to successfully bridge into the other one. But I think, or maybe Funding Circle. I don't know. I think we'll start to see more and more of that over time, but it's still very early stages for a lot of these companies. One of the things that I like to remind people whenever I'm talking to investors or founders in the fintech space is that the finance industry is gigantic. You know, even the biggest fintech companies that you can think of, like say SoFi, I think they raised at a few $1 billion valuation recently. They're doing they've done a couple $1 billion in loans. Like, that's like a bat of an eye for JP Morgan. I mean, $2 billion in loans is like a week's work for Chase. So it's this massive market. Like, startups in the fintech space, even the ones that are unicorns, are still very much in the early innings. And so I think we're going to see a lot more develop over the next few years. And I think there will probably have to be some international expansion there, but we'll see whether or not that actually succeeds. It's very much TBD.
So from your experience with NerdWallet, you went through the journey without losing control. Now you're investing, are you normally taking preference shares? Are you normally looking at founders losing that control early, or they're maintaining control with you on board and helping?
So typically for me, like, investing at the seed stage, I'm just investing in like convertible notes. And then eventually a VC will come in and do a bigger round, and my stock will convert and everything. And the VC is ultimately the one in control. I'll try to be just as helpful as possible along the way. I'll try to make those introductions to useful VCs and stuff. But I'm not going to be on the board. I'm not going to be the one with the fiduciary responsibility to force them to do what they don't want to do or anything like that. And I'm perfectly happy to tell them when the VC is screwing them or when they're not, which terms they should take, which terms they should not. They don't have to take my advice, but yeah.
Well, hey, Jake, thanks so much for coming. I think this was really helpful for everybody here.